Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to issue a warm welcome to Dr. Tom Harris.
Well, thank you, Sandy, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I must say I'm certainly pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I can't think of a better audience than a group of climate realists to hear about the International Climate Science Coalition. But before I get on to describing our coalition, it's fairly newly formed as of in the fall of last year in time for Bali. There were a number of our representatives there. I'd like to tell you about what you obviously already know, but what is the problem? Put very simply, the problem is that governments in developed countries intend to limit carbon dioxide emissions. And of course, that will have very serious implications to both the public and to industry. I just wanted to go through very quickly to put this in perspective some of the points you've already heard many times in the past, but what are the kinds of things that we will see if in fact we have draconian CO2 controls such as those proposed by Senator Boxer? First of all, we'll see a lot of failed businesses, massive unemployment, higher prices and lower services. We'll see a shortage of energy, of course, because much of our energy comes from the various targets that people like Senator Boxer are trying to outlaw or at least diminish. We'll see, of course, a great reduction in available resources and increased damage to the environment. In Canada, I have a number of friends who work in water resources, and they've told me that much of the research on Great Lakes pollution, for example, is being cut in funding. And we're seeing this throughout the environmental research area, where as an effort to get more and more money into climate change, they're sucking money away from things that really should be worked on, like toxic waste dump cleanup and things like that. So the net result of an extreme focus on CO2 is indeed more damage to the environment. A reduced quality of life now and in the future, and of course, increased social discontent because of the reduction in standard of living. So the question we have to ask ourselves as climate realists and as people who'd like to see a good and decent society continue, how can we stop this from happening? Well, first of all, it's important if you're facing any enemy in any war is to understand what's driving it. What is in fact the cause of this problem? Well, here's the problem put in a nutshell. Governments believe that carbon dioxide must be reduced to achieve political success, or at least they have to promise to do it. I don't know if, in fact, many of the current promises will ever come to fruition, but all of the presidential candidates, except as was pointed out earlier, Ron Paul, have promised massive CO2 reductions. Now, that is based on a couple of ideas, and I'm about to say that some of these ideas are wrong. Most politicians believe that the public will support strong CO2 controls to stop climate change. And we're going to look at some polls in a minute to see if, in fact, that's really true. Most mass media also support draconian CO2 controls. And we're going to look at why that's the case, because it's not necessarily just to help the environment. Unfortunately, lobby groups have successfully pushed the climate change agenda very successfully. Many people claim that, in fact, the climate change campaign is the most successful so far of all environmental campaigns ever mounted. It's certainly the largest, and as I'll explain to you later, heavily funded, far more so than any other activity they've had before. And the last problem, and it's a very relevant problem to this conference, is the following. Science has little influence on climate policy. Now, I'm not sure if one of our Canadian scientists is here, but I can tell you a story without referencing his name or the top politician he spoke to because it was given in confidence, but it gives you an idea of the kind of thing that actually is driving climate policy in Canada and probably around the world. After discussing some of the science of climate change with this particular very high-ranking member of the Canadian government, the Canadian government official finally admitted, he said, "You realize that science plays no role in the climate file." That's, in fact, exactly what he said. And he was saying this to one of Canada's leading scientists, who told me this with great consternation. There's other causes, of course, as to what's driving this. Very human nature causes, such as governments and politicians want to be seen as strong leaders. You know, they've never seen a parade. They don't want to lead. They need big problems to tackle that they believe that only they can satisfy. And that, of course, brings up the very famous quote by H.K. Mencken, which I'm sure many of you already heard, and I'll just read it for fun. "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamorous to be led to safety, by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." So that quote, I think, applies very much here. Whether or not the global warming crisis is purely imaginary or only partly imaginary It certainly is nothing like we're hearing from the Al Gores. Now, there are various underlying factors that are in fact driving these particular causes. And the first one is that the public are believed to support CO2 controls. And this is largely because the public, politicians, and media are fed with poll results repeatedly that appear to show strong public support for CO2 control. Well, I don't know if they really do, and we should have a closer look at some of these polls. You see, these polls are not only biased in that they are push polls, and you'll see questions if you actually look at them closely, but the actual reporting on the polls is in fact biased. The media generally endorse polls that support climate alarmism, while they ignore polls that do not. And I'll give you an example of one that, even though it is a push poll, this is a push poll from Yale University, which actually was on the side of Al Gore, and you can see by the kinds of questions they asked, they were obviously trying to show that the public overwhelmingly endorsed carbon dioxide emission control. But yet, here were the results that they found. This was published in September of 2007. They asked the public, what do you think climate scientists think about global warming? And some of the answers are a bit silly, but we'll skip over the significance of the answers, except to just look at the numbers. 48% of them believe that scientists believe that global warming is happening. 3% of them say scientists do not believe it's happening. But a full 40% of Americans say that there's a lot of disagreement in the climate science community as to whether or not global warming is happening, and 9% that say they don't know. Now, so what you end up with is a slight majority, 49%, slightly more than the left-hand column, actually do not believe or don't know whether or not scientists agree. Now, you have to ask, if this was the result of a push poll, and you don't know how many times this poll was carried out before they finally released the results that they did. You know, one thing I learned recently, and I called a number of polling agencies to ask them, can you do 10 polls and actually release the one that statistically happens to be far off on the left that gives you the results that you want? And they said, well, an ethical polling agency wouldn't do that, but, well, they can always go to another agency. So if you have enough money, you can go around and do 10 polls with 10 ethical polling agencies, and then say, oh, look at this. It's way off on the left. We'll pick that one, because of course there is a spread in any poll results. So first of all, the poll can be biased, the interpretation can be biased, and even the poll release that they choose to release may be the one that's far off on the left. Well, predictably, the media totally ignored the Yale survey, and what they did publicize was a same-day survey that came out from the BBC. And I won't read all that to you, except that to say it shows that, oh, worldwide, people endorse CO2 controls, no question about it. But there was one critical comment in the poll, which was not reported by media, that if you look in the poll, kind of make you laugh and make you understand how some of these polls are in fact just giving the results that the pollsters would like by directing people through their questions. I'll just read the quote right out of the BBC poll. Among those who indicate that they have heard nothing at all about global warming, only 47% support significant measures. Well, you have to say, if they know nothing at all about it, how come they have any opinion about supporting or not supporting anything? But what this points out is a well-known effect where if a poll respondent actually senses a desire on the part of the pollster to have a certain answer, that even if they know nothing about it, they'll say, yeah, that's a good idea. You know, that's what we should do, definitely. So the preamble to questions is very important. And so what it means is that in many cases, well, I think you should just count those people out entirely, because they just don't understand anything about the issue, and they even admit it. The underlying factors that we talked about earlier concerning poll results, as I say, they are distorted because they're push polls asking loaded questions, biased interpretations. I'll just continue on here quickly because I mentioned these already. Yet the public, unfortunately, they do believe that, in fact, there is significance to the poll results. And my slides are a bit ahead, and I don't know how to go back, so I'll just leave that on the screen for now. Another story that you might find interesting is I had dinner with a top member of the Canadian government, one of the top advisors, and I asked him point blank, I said, do you believe that carbon dioxide is causing catastrophic climate change? He said, oh, no, of course not. I said, oh, so why are you designing CO2 controls? He said, oh, because the public want it. I said, and how do you know that? Oh, the polls show it. I said, but you know those are push polls, and they're not necessarily reflective of public opinion at all. He said, oh, yeah, we know that. I said, so you know it's probably not a problem, and you know the polls are not meaningful. Why are you enabling strong CO2 controls? He said, because most of the public and the media believe the polls are significant. So what we're ending up here with is we're 2 levels removed from reality, okay? What's driving climate change policy in Canada, and probably much of the world, is the perception that the public support the CO2 controls. It's not that they necessarily support it, and certainly it's not that the science supports it. So we're 2 levels removed. And when we get to our tactics a bit later, we should talk about that because it's a very significant factor. Now, the other underlying factor, of course, there's 4 of them, as I said earlier, why are governments pushing CO2 controls, is that most mass media support savage CO2 controls. And it's true that some of them actually do believe in the climate mantra. Some of them are out there doing what they think is right. We'll get to other possible ulterior motives, but nevertheless, that is certainly a factor. Many reporters are, however, left-leaning social crusaders, and they see that there's secondary benefits to having massive worldwide energy rationing. They believe, I think mistakenly, that this will help level the playing field in the economics of the world. I think it's just going to bring everybody down. No leveling. I suppose it's a leveling. You know, it's a leveling at the bottom. And of course, the media want to be noticed and influential. And if you're a reporter that's competing for a top editorial position in a newspaper, you don't write stories that have no particular influence. You want to say things that are dramatic. You know, it's interesting, when an asteroid was approaching the Earth a few years ago, turned out it missed the Earth by miles. There were some preliminary suggestions that it had a 1 in 1,000 chance of hitting. And of course, that led to major headlines in The Independent in England and in other places. But when they realized that, of course, it was not going to hit the Earth, they didn't have equally large headings. Yeah, on page 36, somewhere down, you know, it's not quite true. So that's not influential, and that's not important, so they didn't give it a big headline. But the final factor, and this is something that I think is really driving a lot of the media coverage, and that is that future catastrophe sells media, advertising, and increases profits. I asked one of the leading editors in Eastern Canada, why will you only publicize one point of view? There are obviously a lot of debate going on out there in the climate science community. He said, yeah, I know that, but our advertisers wouldn't like it. So much for journalistic integrity. Now, as I said before, there's other underlying factors such as lobby groups. I won't go through it. They've obviously been very successful in their PR, and they give us examples of what we should try to copy, at least the civilized part of what they do. They're very successful also because they don't give up, and they happily work for years with low or little pay. They're well coordinated internationally, something that we're trying to do with this new coalition. They are heavily, heavily funded. And you know, I should give you an example here from the Pew Institute. It's called the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. And if you look at their funding over the last 10 years, the lowest they were funded at per year was about $3.4 million. This is just one of many organizations. I have a list of about several dozen here, and the total is 116 million. And these are just groups whose job it is to push an agenda. They're not groups that are designing scientific research programs to actually uncover the science. In fact, here is the Pew Senders Mandate: to educate the public and key policymakers about the causes and potential consequences of climate change, and to encourage the domestic and international community to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. To accomplish this objective, the Pew Center will, 1, release highly publicized reports on the environmental impacts and economic and policy issues. And here's the last one: educate the public. Through advertising, cross-country speaking events, and conferences. And it's very interesting because if you go further down here, you find out the Pew Charitable Trusts, they also fund a Center for Civic Journalism to promote their ideology. So they're not just doing the work, they're training the journalists on how to report their work. Okay, so I don't know how much of that we're doing. We'll get to that in a second. Now, the last factor I wanted to talk about briefly was the fact that climate policy has little to do with science. And there's some very basic reasons for that, of course. Most in the public don't understand science, so they rely on government summaries, they rely on media reports. And that's, of course, potentially very damaging. We also see that, here we go here. Most scientists, of course, don't want to engage in that kind of lobbying, and that's not terribly surprising. To professionally counter these underlying factors, we must do several things: continue to sway the public opinion against it, and report on public opinion properly. And I'll go through this a bit quickly because I want to give Vincent Gray, who's one of our advisors, by the way, his full 20 minutes. So I think I have about 3 minutes to go. We want to use the tools of the pros, okay, when it comes to lobbying. That's not something our group is focused especially on, but other groups like Heartland are indeed very good in that area. we want to, of course, continue to conduct good science and to promote its use in climate policy. Now, there are various groups doing this already, and I'm sure you've heard of them all. I won't list them. But there are several components missing, and these are things that we hope to incorporate into the new International Climate Science Coalition. We need regular, high-impact media coverage of the findings of leading scientists, not just one or two publications, but we need to have hundreds all over the world. We need to have a high degree of information sharing and cooperation between groups, so that when Vincent Gray, for example, has an article published in New Zealand, we can take the same piece and we can submit it to newspapers all over North America and Europe. Then we have a nicely well-coordinated response, where letters to the editor and phone calls are made. Congratulations on publishing that article. You know, it's interesting because I've had many of my articles opposed so strongly by environmentalists through phone calls and letters to the editor that they just simply dry up. They just won't publish us again. So this does have feedback. I mean, these are people that run these newspapers, and they're scared and impressed and encouraged depending on the feedback they get. We have to have grassroots organizations doing exactly that kind of thing, coordinated local activism. And finally, as I said, we need unbiased polling and good press coverage. I won't read the whole mandate of the ICSC, I almost said IPCC, get these initials mixed up. But the bottom line is we are committed to bringing to bear on the international debate a high degree of cooperation. And in fact, that's the main principal objective. We're also aiming towards bringing to bear the ability to assess and counterbalance the various reports of the IPCC. We'd like to sway public opinion against costly climate control plans, and we will demonstrate various things, how these groups, activists, media, government, and the UN, have misrepresented the state of climate science, the opinions of climate scientists, and public perception. We're also going to analyze the reports of the IPCC, pointing out the serious mistakes, and also the consequences of bad policy decisions. Now, I'll be cutting this off a little early because timing is always tighter than you expect when you practice presentations. But in my handout, you can see our various strategies and our tactics. And I'm going to focus just to end the presentation on a couple of these because I think they're crucially important. And that is to work with current climate realist groups to foster a new level of international cooperation and information sharing. I work with the Natural Resources Stewardship Project in Canada. And one of our friends, the Friends of Science, they and us really don't communicate very well. We don't know what projects they're doing until we see it in the newspaper or hear it on the radio. But that's not good enough. We have to have a much greater degree of fostering true international collaboration, without threatening, of course, the separate identities, objectives, or the independence of various groups. That's basically what this says. We're going to have various tactics. One of the things is, of course, to publish documents that will be available to people, both at the scientific level and in the public, to significantly impact the public and to counter the kind of dogma we're hearing. One point, and I think I will end here, this is a very important factor that we must engage in, and that is quick response to the opposition. You know, they have exceptionally quick response to our articles or to our announcements. I'm sure with this, well, you probably saw in the lead up to this particular event, our opponents were slash and burning it long before we even started. Well, we need that equally fast a response. Okay, when reports come out, we have to have groups of international scientists who are prepared to speak to media on specific topics. Hurricanes, okay, a report on hurricanes, you go to these people. We're doing that with NRSP to a certain extent, but it must be done on a great deal more international basis. We have to respond very quickly while it's still hot in the press, so that perhaps even in the same coverage of the initial announcement from the IPCC, we can have our response. And that's going to take a lot of cooperation and a lot of coordination. It's not something that's done easily. It's something that requires an international organization to do it quickly. When a bill is going before the US Senate, we want people in Italy and Japan to know about it within hours so that they can actually send letters to editors, send letters into the the Senate, etc., just like the environmentalists do. Because otherwise they're getting an avalanche within days or even hours of our publications and practically dead silence from us for quite a while until we get our act together after announcements from the other side. So I'll just end on this slide to say that that is indeed one of the main objectives of the ICSC. Very quick response and the ability to do it professionally, on time, in the news hook before it's actually old news. So I've certainly enjoyed talking to you today, and I encourage you to pick up our handouts. There are flyers at the very back of the room which describe some of the things that I wasn't able to cover today. Thanks very much.